Welcome to Talking Ukraine in English.
Coming up on episode 5, our guest is Dr. Lada Roslycky, the founder and managing partner of Black Trident Defense and Security Consulting Group. Lada is a Ukraine expert based in Kyiv, where she has continued to live since the start of the full-scale invasion.
And it continues to be a life-changing daily activity living in Ukraine. What I'm seeing now is a complete destruction and effective genocide of Ukraine. Since March 2022, when the attack started, I got a few phone calls and said, Lada, you better get out of Kyiv because it's possible that you're on these lists. And they were really close to my house. So I was hiding in the western parts of Ukraine for the better part of 3 months. My boyfriend was killed in Dnipro, which really made it something very close. He was killed in April of 2022. I have a lot of friends on the front and inside of the armed forces, including international legionnaires. A close friend of mine was killed last week. So death becomes something normal. You don't cry anymore. It's just like, okay, they're gone. We have to work harder. You really realize and understand how little you need in life to be truly happy. So that is the biggest positive aspect, and how humanity and what is true resilience, and why the Russians and the West are shocked, and perhaps some of them are pissed off at Ukraine because they didn't know the Kozackiego rodu. They didn't understand what that means. And that means like, this is our God-given land and we're going to fight for it. So that is very exhausting 3 years into the war, and very disappointing seeing unfulfilled promises. There's this mantra in Ukraine that you can't complain because the men on the front have it worse.
Here we are, talking Ukraine in English with Dr. Lada Roslycky, episode number 5. I would say Lada is a Ukraine expert. She's been living there for many years, on and off. Again, I like to I think it works better if you tell me a little bit more about your backstory than me reading your bio to people. So what makes you an expert in Ukraine, Lada? Where did your Ukraine expertise begin?
That's a great question. And I think that it started with my pointed decision not to have anything to do with Ukraine whatsoever after I was 18 years old and moved to the Netherlands. But I think that there's a lot of fate in what happens with people. So I was born to a family that had to escape Ukraine. And a part of my family, my mom was already born in Germany. So I'm Canadian American. And I grew up in that diasporan ecosystem. And in a certain extent, I really loved it because it felt like home, and it was the language and the culture. It just basically, maybe on a DNA level, it clicked. At the same time, I really despised it because it was like, oh my God, like I'm American, Canadian, and what do I need to be doing all of this Ukrainian stuff for? Why do I have to go to Ukrainian church? Why do I have to go to Ukrainian school and learn about all of these suffering people? And that suffering, which permeates the Ukrainian diaspora to this date, is something that I consciously chose to run away from, and wanted to do nothing like Ukraine, but we have a world. And that determination to learn more about the world took me to the Netherlands, where I did my Dutch law degree and a master's in international law, where my global love made me specialized in international trade law, international humanitarian law, which is war, because I grew up with war stories. I think normal kids in America and Canada, they go to bed with normal, nice little nursery rhymes, but I was put to sleep with stories of how my aunt would take off boots of any soldier, German soldier or Red Army soldiers, and they would steal these shoes to put them on the men or even the women who were escaping in the caravans. So, not wanting to be associated as a Ukrainian, I decided to look into weather modification because we have the war and we have environmental issues. So I really narrowed down the focus of what is the most interesting thing in the world, and that for me was weather modification. And I was lucky enough to have the United Nations International Yearbook of International Law give me page 1. So I created a framework for weather modification technology as sustainable development, not as a weapon of war, which we do see it now being used by Russia and other countries, but particularly in the war as it pertains to Ukraine, and also something like ecocide. And after that, as fate would have it, I didn't end up in New York or Brussels as I was hoping. I ended up in Kyiv in 2004 after I finished my master's. And I had a really great position through the Canadian government because the Canadians took me. I was applying for both the American, the Dutch, and the Canadian side. But they had a wonderful program for young consultants, and they put me into the NATO Information and Documentation Center in Kyiv. So I was very, very happy, but I also was filled with dread because I knew what Ukraine is and how terrible it is. And that was my kickstart to becoming a true Ukraine expert on a professional level. So working with NATO, information and documentation belongs to the public diplomacy division. Some people have no idea what that means, which is a shame, but it's really like communicating what is NATO, what are the values and principles of NATO, and why other countries should be attracted to joining NATO and living up to those standards. So after doing that for a while, I became like a super nerd and went to the University of Groningen, the Royal University of the Netherlands, where I wrote my PhD together at Harvard at the Black Sea Security Program. It was a great time, very intense. After 5 years in 2011, I predicted and showed in a very deep analysis the manner in which the Kremlin and what I call now red privilege inside of Ukraine would take Crimea away using psychological operations, so information and psychological operations, and corruption as statecraft. And everybody accepted it. It was a wonderful thesis, but it was only 3 years after I gained my PhD that they took Crimea away. And then suddenly everybody started calling me, and on television, radio, academic organizations and universities would call and say, we would like to engage you further. And then in 2013, when Maidan started, I was at that time between Washington and Ottawa because I didn't really know where I belong. I had been living in the Netherlands and Ukraine for so long. And there was a date in April of 2014 where, as a co-founder of Euromaidan Ottawa, which was an organization when Maidan was happening in Ukraine, as you know, Demian, because you were like also very effective and involved. Diasporan organizations all over the world were creating their Maidans. So we created Euromaidan Ottawa, and we focused on getting the messaging to the Canadian government and to Canadian civil society and elite groups to support, to support Ukraine. And the day I saw the torn apart bodies of 3 beautiful young men naked with their intestines hanging out on the side of a river, particularly Volodymyr Rybak, it was my end. I can't be in North America. I need to go to Ukraine and fight there.
Wait, so
And
what three bodies, like what was this? Are you talking about the protesters who were kidnapped during the Maidan, or what?
I'm sorry, this was actually in Slavyansk. Girkin, also known as Strelkov, at that time was the leader, the commander of that area in Donetsk Oblast. And what they were doing when the protesters or the pro-Ukrainian forces, including Pravi sector, including just violent kids from the streets of Kyiv that went to fight when we knew that the Russians were coming in, Strelkov was killing them, and particularly inside of the SBU building in Slavyansk. And torture was um, really horrific. This was just the beginning, like the sign of things to come, and what we're seeing to this day today. And unfortunately, Strelkov got away with all of those killings, but he's also gotten away for being one of the coordinators of shooting down MH17. So this man, he has his own Telegram channel and continues putting out narratives for the Ruski Mir, is actually the evil, or a part of the evil that really triggered me to move to Ukraine and apply my academic knowledge and leave the ivory tower to really engage and get my boots on and boots on the ground and deal with practice and really lives, real lives. The Ukraine actually had its first English language international broadcasting channel, and that belonged to 1+1 Media, which was under Kolomoisky. At that time, Poroshenko and Kolomoisky were really at heads with each other, which was a difficult choice for me to make. While most of the people after Maidan got onto that Poroshenko crew, the only option I saw for myself as a professional was really to engage with that English language broadcasting channel and put myself in there. So I put in a lot of years and effort doing work as the director of strategic communications for 1+1. And we created television programs. We had journalists going out into the front lines. We had all of the international community engaging also with the European Union, which funded a lot of programming, which I would like to come back to later, because some of the programming that the EU funded, or the European Commission funded, actually ended up funding a man who is in prison for treason in Ukraine. At that time, he was an anchor for a couple of television programs. So it was, everything is so intertwined with each other. So that was a lot of television, a lot of creating programs, a lot of outreach, and volunteering. At the end of the day, Ukraine exists mostly because of the volunteers and the people who literally give their last pennies to, or kopike, to make sure that the men on the front don't freeze or starve or die. So that was that was 2014, 15, 16. I was an advisor to a couple of people inside of the Ukrainian government, also for some international organizations. But it always, as much as I wanted to get away, even to Mongolia, for instance, I had opportunities. It always brought me back to Ukraine, because it's about right and wrong. It's really about justice and the rule of law. And the territory of Ukraine, Kuchma called it a football field, where we're going to see the war. Some people call it a proxy war of the US against Russia. But Ukraine has to win, because truth is on Ukraine's side, and truth does exist. We should revisit who removed truth from our vocabulary by adding post-truthism in 2016 into the English dictionaries.
Okay, well, taking a step back to truth, the information sphere is largely responsible for this war. I mean, these Russians believe in their truth, which is that these are their lands, that they are fighting the West, that they believe that they are doing something good for their country, right? And these people believe that right is on their side. But so they have a different understanding of what is true, or uh, I don't know. It's like,
No, not really. I disagree with you. Because if the Russians were really interested in the well-being of their state, we would have more than 25% of Russian population with access to electricity, running water, and gas. So they're not really interested in the well-being of their state. Russia, as a state, is one of the richest territories on the planet. I mean, look at it, it's huge. But it's not about values and principles and how can we make our land great. It's how can we get more territory and more control in order to steal more. And we have to remember that since 1953, the Soviet and then the Russian economy has been almost completely under the influence and direction of the underground economy. So it's easy to buy people.
right, but I guess I was saying like these foot soldiers that they're sending to the front, like they're well, I guess they're also going for money too. Um, the, there's a monetary incentive for them because a lot of them come from really poor places with few options.
Right.
So there is sort of like a caste system in Russia in place where people at the top, are the government and Putin's circle, but then there's the people living in like St. Petersburg and Moscow, which are sort of middle class, and then sort of like the rest of Russia, which is largely like, a lower caste. And
Yeah, I mean there are 25 captured nations inside of Russia. And they have their own languages, they have their own cultures, they have their own religions. And they're captured because Russia is the last colony, like the last empire or colony. And these nations want their freedom. And when we look at how the Chechens, it was a very delicate topic. So the true Chechens, not the Kadyrov Chechens, how they have been sent to be eliminated in Ukraine after the 2 wars or 3 wars that they had, and the Buryati, and all of those really beautiful cultures, they're being ethnically cleansed and genocided by Russia because they're the first ones that Russia sent. Russia, as you said, like, great point. Everybody in the West thinks that Russia is like St. Petersburg and Moscow. And anybody who wants to go and join Steven Seagal, if I were a billionaire, I would buy like airplanes and take those Americans and put them on an airplane like far away from St. Petersburg and let them figure out how to not live with a toilet or water or electricity, and then come back to America and kiss the ground that they live on. I think that Americans have a very skewed perception, many of them, of what Russia is. And that's a direct result of its impeccable information policy and foreign information manipulation.
yeah, can you talk more about that because that's related to your work? How does Russia use or manipulate the information space? Both in Ukraine, but like I guess for people listening here, maybe like in the West, in Europe, and the States, how does Russia, yeah, literally manipulate it? It's they're pretty good at it.
They're perfect. If they weren't war criminals, I would like to work for them because they're the best. I have not, with all due respect to the other countries that I've worked with, or my company has worked with, the Russians are the best because they manipulate to the degree that it's almost impossible to believe that you're being manipulated. And a very sincere and weak aspect of the human being is that the human being does not want to admit that it's been fooled. So even when somebody understands that they have fallen victim to, plainly speaking, fake news, they have this ego, and it's very difficult for people to say, no, that's not true. I made a mistake. I fell for it. So the theater of operation for Russia is primarily focused on its own people. And it's very difficult for me to say, like, with all due respect to the Russians, because the Russians have a responsibility for what is happening to Ukraine. They also are living under a very strict authoritarian regime. And very few people understand that Beria's grandson is one of the top advisors to Putin. So these are grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the advisors of Stalin, who organized the Holodomor in Ukraine, who are giving effect to information policy inside of Russia. That having been said, if we transfer our focus from the field or the theater of Russia, Ukraine, very unfortunately, and this is where I call out Ukraine's Western allies, has never had a very effective, actually, it has not had a policy of lustration. And lustration was very effective in Eastern Germany, for instance. It means that anybody who is involved with the regime does not have a right to participate in politics. And their children and grandchildren are very clearly investigated before they're allowed to enter into any type of positions of power, particularly in the government. Ukraine never had that. And that's an explanation of why Russian information warfare was so effective inside of Ukraine, because we had jokers, evil jokers like Medvedchuk, for instance, or Derkach, or Shufrich in power, who were able to manipulate the media, the television, the film industry, all of the communication, and they were loyal to Russia. So when the West came in and the Ukrainians were like, oh, we have our culture, we have our history, we need to develop our knowledge and understanding, or teach Ukrainian society about the horrors of what happened during the Bolshevik and communist period. There was a lot of resistance, but the Ukrainians at this time, slowly, but they're starting to understand that they have been fooled. When we look at the theater of the European Union, for the sake of brevity, I'll combine the European Union with North America. What Russia does there, the Europeans and North Americans already see Great Russia. And usually they don't say Soviet Union, they say Russia, Russia, Russia. And within that framework of Great Russia, Russia has a very specialized manner of using its information policies to create how do you say this, conflict and lack of trust within the EU, the Euro-Atlantic territories. So they criticize and they take truth. So really good information psychological operations, they have to have at least 80% truth. 20% truth. So you can have like 80% of complete nonsense, but if you have that 20% of truth, people will empathize, they will sympathize. So what Russia does, and we've seen connections during COVID with the anti-vaxxers, with Black Lives Matters, some of the mega I don't want to point out only the Republicans, but I think MAGA falls into a special category of Republicans. A lot of their narratives are actually directly reflecting the foreign policy of the Kremlin. And as an analyst, what I do is really find the documents, the policies of what Russia is saying in the West in order for the population in the West to think that they live in a shithole, but they don't. And we need the police, and the police are good. And there are a lot of policies that need to be explained. But Russia is doing a great job saying, we feel for you, you poor capitalist victims. And if you watch Russia Today for like a week, you'll understand that actually they're great at pointing out the issues that our presidents, our presidential candidates, our local representatives should be addressing in a more effective way and communicating in a much more effective way to the citizens. And because we have a huge failure in the West with that communication, and also with the civil military communication, which is almost zero in the EU and North America, the Russians know where to hit, and they know how to bribe, and they're very rich because they know that they have high stakes in the game, and the Americans think it's a conspiracy theory, and everybody has to blame it on the Mexicans. You know?
I'm just thinking, like, imagine they applied those skills towards improving like their own society, or evolving society in general, rather than trying to tear it apart. Why do
I
they
mean, you
want to tear
saw
it
the
apart? What is the end game?
well, the end game. Okay, first, scorched earth policies. When we see what is happening, and you've been there, you've been to the front. I don't like lately. You haven't been there to see the devastation and destruction of what Russian so-called liberation is. And the end game is to gain territory and to build the network, that is based on corruption. As so, maybe you know the term corruption as statecraft. Russia's number one at it. Well, there are some other countries who do it, but Russia's the most powerful one. And it's basically they look at the United States, countries in Africa, what's happening in South Africa currently is very important. And rather than like what the Western allied countries do, they're like, oh, we'll focus on, of course, the economy is very important, but it's also about values and principles of freedom, rule of law is key. Russians, they communicate with decision makers, albeit on the lowest civil society level or on the presidential level, and they pay them off. They say, we will bring a factory, we will do this. Here's like $10 million or $1 billion. And I say a billion, understanding the number, in order for them to be able to spread their power over globally. And it's a creation of a very select few of hyper rich families and a bunch of very poor people who they don't really care about. Lack of understanding of how much our hearts and minds actually mean to national and international security. They're the key components. It's a proven fact.
So we've been talking some pretty high level stuff, and we could keep talking about NATO and things like this. But you're there in Ukraine right now, so like, let's get some of your perceptions about. And you've been there since the full invasion started, for the most part. So what has your life been like there? What are you seeing?
It has been life-changing, and it continues to be a life-changing daily activity living in Ukraine. So, of course, the war started in 14, but what I'm seeing now is a complete um, destruction and effective genocide of Ukraine. And right now, I'm not in Kyiv. For the first time since 2022, since March 2022, when the attack started, I got a few phone calls and said, Lada, you better get out of Kyiv because it's possible that you're on these lists. And they were really close to my house. So it was already a terrible feat to just have that run bag and get in the car and find the way where you're going to hide. And so I was hiding in the western parts of Ukraine for the better part of 3 months. And in a village with the air raid sirens, I mean, nobody teaches you where a rocket can fall. So everybody was in panic. And my boyfriend was killed in Dnipro, which really made it something very close. He was killed in April of 2022. Everybody was just working 24 hours a day, volunteering and trying to save lives. And the safe house that I was in, we had people from Bucha and Irpin that were coming, and this was 650 kilometers that they had to escape, and they couldn't get out of their basements. And one of the men who I ran away with was talking every day to a lady who was in her basement, terrified because the Russians were outside and they could hear the shooting. So we're in this village with these old people and a bunch of strangers. It was quite terrifying, and I had no underwear. I had like 2 pairs of underwear or something because we ran so quickly. And one of the coolest things about the war is you really realize and understand how little you need in life to be truly happy. So that is the biggest positive aspect, and how humanity and what is true resilience, and why the Russians and the West are shocked, and perhaps some of them are pissed off at Ukraine because they didn't know the Shemys Kozackiego Rodu. They didn't understand what that means. And that means like this is our God-given land and we're going to fight for it. So that is very exhausting 3 years into the war, and very disappointing seeing unfulfilled promises. On the ground, there's a lot of corruption. A lot of the people who are now, like, I left Kyiv so that I could sleep and work because we're under continuous air raids. And the winter is predicted to be really bad. And again, no electricity. And you have no idea what it's like to have 5 generators behind your building and a generator in front of your building, and all of that noise and the fumes were coming into my apartment. Where at one time I was just like falling asleep, and it turned out to be from the carbon monoxide coming in. So it's all, and you still fight. You can't, there's this mantra in Ukraine that you can't complain because the men on the front have it worse. So everybody's still focused on the men on the front, and that feeling of us being basically abandoned, and the shipments that are promised, they're not coming in on time.
So that was part 1 of our conversation with Dr. Lada Roslycky. We covered a lot of different topics, so I decided to break this one into 2 parts. So stay tuned for episode number 6 as we continue our conversation and get more of Lada's unique insights from on the ground in Ukraine.